All right, class, it is week 8 of the quarter, and we will be considering Old Testament poetry in this session. I think this is one of the more difficult genres of the scriptures to not only interpret at times, but also to know kind of what to do with it as far as communication. Especially the Proverbs, maybe Job, and so it's a great part of the Bible though, and so we need to understand it. I do want to mention some resources on the Psalms that I have found useful. One is this book, How to Read the Psalms by Tremper Longman. Tremper Longman. I like a lot of what Tremper has written, and this is a fairly small book on reading the Psalms. A great commentary on the Psalms I have found is the Expositor's Bible Commentary on the Psalms. Also, you'll see Tremper Longman and David Garland as the general editors. Also, another contributor is Willem van Gimmeren, not William, but Willem van Gimmeren is a contributor to this as well. Very good Old Testament scholar. And then this series, the NIV application commentary series, is, I think, quite good most of the time. And this is volume 1 of the Psalms by Gerald Wilson. And I found this to be very useful, not only in the Psalms, but in other books of the Bible. That series, I think, is exceptional as well. So over 1/3 of the Word of God, of the Bible, is comprised of poetry. So that's a significant percentage. And so it deserves our attention. The poetic books of the Bible are the Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, and Lamentations. I have often found that Psalms are good one-off sermons for myself or for other preachers in our church, other men in our church perhaps. By one-off, I mean the Psalms are self-contained. You can assign someone a Psalm 5, say, hey, study Psalm 5 and bring a message on it. And if you just need someone to fill in, or it's a great way to take breaks between series, or just get people out of maybe a particular book of the Bible that you've spent a lot of time in, and you just want to give them a break and go to a psalm, which is very emotionally written. Very emotive language is used in the Psalms, and people can relate to the Psalms, to the psalmist, because oftentimes he is grieving. He is crying out to God for mercy, for help, for rescue. And so it really connects with people, and that's part of what we're going to talk about in this session. So the poetry of the Old Testament focuses on our emotional response to God, as well as on our emotional response to those who are hostile to God and his people. So these are important genres. It's an important genre, I should say. Whereas the epistles, like of the New Testament, it's didactic. It's teaching material, propositional truth. If you look at the narratives, they're telling a story, and they too can be emotional. But a lot of the scriptures, like the epistles or law, appeal to the mind and reason. The Psalms and the poetic books appeal to the heart and the emotions. And much like a painting does, your textbook will talk about this. I think they do a good job of that. You find uh, art to be compelling visually and emotionally. And as you look at a work of art, you're often going to be looking for the emotion behind the artist when he painted that and what he's communicating by the images that he has is depicting. So some of the elements of Old Testament poetry that are important to know about. One is the term terseness, terse or terseness. This element refers to a poet's use of a limited number of words. So, oftentimes, poetic books don't mince words, they don't waste words. Take Psalm 25, verse 4. Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Right? You see, it's a succinct statement. There's a lot that can be said in a short amount of words. I think we, especially preachers, we need to learn that the Lord listens to short prayers just like He listens to long ones. We can oftentimes save words and time in our messages by saying things more clearly, using fewer words, but frankly, maybe clearer. How about the structure of Old Testament poetry? A term you're going to come across a lot in reading about poetry is parallelism. This element names when two lines of text are used to convey a single thought. Two lines, one thought. You have also synonymous parallelism. This is a specific kind of structure. This type of parallelism involves a close similarity between lines using words with similar meanings. An example would be Psalm 2:4. Say one line says, line A says, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. Line B, the Lord scoffs at them. So if you look at those two lines, they are similar and in their structure and in their meaning, a bit sort of repeating the same thought in a different way. By the way, sometimes I think students wonder if in hermeneutics we are sort of making up stuff as we go. And, like, are we coming up with these concepts like synonymous parallelism? And my response to that would be this, and about a lot of principles that we talk about in Bible interpretation. My answer is no. What we should be doing is recognizing what God the Holy Spirit has inspired and what He has divinely put in the text. And we're simply discovering what He did and the way He did it. So I would argue that God put synonymous parallelism in the scriptures, or He put, frankly, these genres in the Bible. We're recognizing that the 66 books of God's inspired and inerrant word were written differently. God communicates His word in different forms and in types of literature and different types of writing, and we owe it to God to recognize what He did and the way He did it. So just a little side note there. Developmental parallelism. In this type of parallelism, the second line develops further the idea of the first line. An example, Psalm 121, verse 3. Line A would say, He will not let your foot slip. Line B, He who watches over you will not slumber. Okay, so in the first line, God is not going to let your foot slip. In the second line, it develops that thought by saying, well, how's He going to do it? Because he's not sleeping. He's watching over you and he's not slumbering. How about illustrative parallelism? In this type of parallelism, line A conveys the idea, and line B illustrates it with an example. Here's an example of illustrative parallelism, Psalm 140, verse 7. Line A says, Sovereign Lord, my strong deliverer. Line B, you shield my head in the day of battle. So line B there, God shielding my head in battle, is an illustration of how the sovereign Lord is my deliverer. So again, it's developing the thought, or excuse me, illustrating the thought of the first line. Then there is contrastive parallelism. As the name implies, there's a contrast between line B and line A. So an example would be Psalm 1:6. Line A says, For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous. Line B, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. A key word there would be the conjunction but, right? For this is true, the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but contrast the way of the wicked, it leads to destruction. Okay. Formal parallelism. This is a miscellaneous category of parallelism. It's kind of generic, you could say. Psalm 2:6 would be one example where line A says, I have installed my king. Line B, on Zion, my holy hill. So God has installed his king. Where is that location? On Zion, the holy hill. So you see, parallelism of various kinds plays an important role in the structure of the Psalms. It's important to know, what am I dealing with here when I go to read it and interpret it and communicate it. How about acrostics? Acrostics are an important element of some Old Testament poetry. This element occurs when each successive line of poetry starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That is obviously not always clear to us in our English translations. So you'll come across those things, for example, in some Psalms. And as you research it with good scholarly materials like good commentaries, those will be definitely brought out if in any way that it's significant or it should be by those you're studying and those you're reading behind. You have figurative imagery. This element names how poets paint pictures rather than write essays. You have analogies like figurative imagery, like a simile, which uses like or as to draw a comparison. An example would be Psalm 42, verse 1. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. So as the deer pants, like the deer who pants, my soul pants for you, my God. Psalm 42, verse 1. There is a simile there, an analogy. Another type of figurative imagery is a metaphor. A metaphor draws a comparison by direct statement. A common one, well-known one, is Psalm 23:1. The Lord is my shepherd. So a simile will use like or as. A metaphor will use is. The Lord uses this in the Gospels. He'll talk about the kingdom of God being like a mustard seed or like a treasure in a field. That would be a simile. But when he says, I am the door, or I am the good shepherd, or the Lord is my shepherd, like Psalm 23, then it's a metaphor. Then there's an analogy. An indirect analogy uses the analogous item without directly stating the comparison. An example would be Psalm 91, verse 4. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. So an indirect analogy that's using the analogous item without directly stating the comparison, but it's there. The Lord's faithfulness will be like a shield and rampart. Hyperbole is used in the poets. It's a conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect. Like Psalm 42, verse 3. My tears have been my food day and night. Well, not obviously literally have tears been the psalmist's food all day, but it's exaggeration for the sake of effect to emphasize or stress the greatness of his grief. Personification. This occurs when human features are attributed to non-human entities. Like Isaiah 1:2. Hear me, you heavens. Listen, earth. Right? So the heavens are treated as though they have ears, in the earth as well. So human personal features, human features are attributed to you could say, objects that are impersonal and not human. Another important word here, related word, big word, anthropomorphism. Anthro, it comes from the term anthropos, which means man. Morph means to change. So it's the idea that God is represented with human features or characteristics. So in this case, rather than intangible or physical objects like inanimate objects like the earth or the heavens being personified, here the divine nature, God himself, is being represented with human features or characteristics. Like Psalm 19:4, in the heavens God has pitched a tent for the sun. So God is here portrayed as a man pitching a tent. You might also think of language used where God is spoken of as having a hand or an arm. His right hand or his right arm is mighty to save. His eyes, again, God is being attributed with human features to communicate to us what he's doing, what he's saying, how he's acting in a passage. Then there is zoomorphism or zoomorphism, which occurs when non-human images are described to use used to describe God. You've got, of course, the prefix zoo, like zoology, the study of animals, right? So here's where non-human, maybe animal-like images or descriptions are used to describe God. An example being Psalm 91, verse 4, where God is described as having feathers and wings. Well, obviously, he does not literally have feathers and wings, where he says he will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. But it's used to describe God. Then substitution as a figurative imagery tool in the poets. Effects and causes occur when an effect is stated figuratively as a substitute for the literal cause. An example being Proverbs 19:3, a foolish child is his father's ruin. Well, there's a cause and effect relationship where an effect is stated figuratively as a substitute for the literal cause. So a foolish child is his father's ruin is a good example of that. Representation occurs when a representative part of an entity is substituted for the entity itself. So again, these are all just important elements that are found throughout the Old Testament poet books. Now, in the Old Testament poets, they will often use cities or tribes to represent an entire nation. Uh, you might have an example here of uh, in Psalm 20, verse 7, that some trust in chariots, right? Means of war, and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. So, an apostrophe, this falls into the miscellaneous category of figurative imagery. An apostrophe occurs when a poet addresses a person as present, even though they are not actually present. Like Psalm 2, verse 10. Therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Well, there the psalmist is addressing kings and rulers, though they may not be physically present, he's speaking indirectly to them. That would be an example of an apostrophe. Irony is used throughout the scriptures, but especially in poetry. This occurs when a poet says the exact opposite of what he really means for the sake of effect or communicating a point. Like Job 38:18. Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. So, God there is speaking to Job, and, almost in times it sounds like he's almost belittling Job, but he's making the point that Job has a very limited understanding of the world and of the universe. And God is almost ridiculing him, but not in a belittling way, but in a way to make a point about his sovereignty in suffering. Word plays. This element occurs when a poet plays off variant possible meanings of a word, or else plays off similar sounds. So Jeremiah 3:22, return faithless people, I will cure you of backsliding. So here God is playing off of this term here of backsliding, telling them to return, and or Jeremiah 3, let's see, 3:22. Turn, you sons of turning, and I will cure you of backsliding. No, I'm sorry, Jeremiah 3:22. Turn, you sons of turning, I will cure your turning. He's playing off of the same word, but for the sake of effect, to play off that, to make a point. They're turning away. Turn. They've been turning. He tells them to turn, and he will cure them of turning. All right. So your textbook will give you an example of interpreting from the Psalms. They give you, I think, the example of Psalm 116, 1 through 4. You can see how they take the interpretive journey through that. Let me skip ahead. So the Psalms do not function primarily for the teaching of doctrine or moral behavior. Instead, they're inspired models of how to talk and sing to God. I mean, they're the songbook of the Old Testament. So you're not going to go to the Psalms in order to construct intricately detailed doctrine. A lot of things are happening in the Psalms that I don't know that we would necessarily recommend at times, but they're raw, they're real. That's why you should use them in your devotional time. Sometimes I don't even know what to say in prayer, and I recently was very, very upset, very grieved about something, and I opened up the Psalms and I literally prayed through Psalms 3 through 7, those Psalms. And I made those Psalms my prayers to God. As I read through them, I prayed them as though they were just my words and my prayers to God in the situation that I was in, and I was using them to cry out to God the way the psalmist was, and I found it incredibly refreshing and helpful. Um, the context of the Psalms, there are seasons of well-being that evoke gratitude. There are seasons of anguish. There are seasons of hurt and alienation and suffering, seasons of surprise when we're overwhelmed with God's goodness and gifts. So the Psalms, I think the best word I can say again is they are raw, and I love them for that. Um, we can go to the Psalms and find the full range of human emotion on display and communicated there in any season that we're in, and they can help us to know what to say to God. And at times, the psalmist is just crying out for mercy, crying out in just absolute despondency. And maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there now. If not, you're going to be there. We're all going to be there at different seasons of our lives. And that's why we need the poetry, right? We don't need someone always to give us a lecture in theology. Lectures in theology are awesome. We need them in the right season, at the right time. But sometimes we need to practice the ministry of presence, being present, being silent, and being a listening ear. And when that time and that season passes, then there may be the right occasion to give someone a lecture in theology. But let me tell you, they're only going to let you lecture them in theology if you're the one who sat with them and wept with them and prayed with them and cried with them and grieved with them and listened to them in the season of difficulty. So, good ministry lesson for us here in the Psalms. I hope you're having a great week. We're nearing the end of the quarter. Stay strong and finish well, brothers and sisters. God bless you.